Holy Father, thank you for these dedicated teachers and learners who have gathered together. Lord, please help me to communicate the useful stuff and the inspiring stuff and not always get hung up on the detail stuff, um, despite the research that I've done. And so, Lord, I just ask you, according to your grace and your purpose, that you prepare us to teach these lessons. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So, even though Acts 22 that we had last session uh, closes with Claudius Lysias, just a second. Here we go. Claudius Lysias, the commander of the tower Antonia, which was a part of Herod's palace and up close to Temple Hill. And Claudius Lysias was the Roman commander there. And at the end of the last chapter, he was trying to get to the bottom of the disturbance, and he was bringing Paul unbound before the Sanhedrin. And so our focus tonight is Paul's appearance before the Sanhedrin, the plot against his life, the escape to Caesarea, and the initial trial in front of Antonius Felix. So, if you would imagine a film camera that's dollying, slowly moving into the first scene as Paul, now in front of the Sanhedrin, looks intently at his accusers and begins to speak. Because if we were to look at tonight's session, we're basically looking at this in terms of 9, very long scenes, or some of them are very long. In scene 1, Paul faces off against Ananias the high priest. And in scene 2, Paul actually takes a definitive side in the Sanhedrin. In scene 3, we have the counterpoint of Jesus' perspective and promise to Paul versus the Jews' intent and plot against Paul. In scene 4, Paul's nephew saves the day. In scene 5, Claudius Lysias is going to send Paul away by night. In scene 6, Antoninus Felix is going to agree to hear the case. In scene 7, we see the charges against Paul by this very eloquent attorney by the name of Tertullus. In scene 8, we have Paul's defense. And in scene 9, we have not only Felix's inconclusive verdict, but also his encounter with Drusilla, his wife, and himself in talking with Paul that he abruptly ends at the end of chapter 24. So, scene number 1, Ananias, Paul, and the Sanhedrin. And as we dolly in and we see Paul's face, it actually begins with a reference to Paul's courage. He looked intently at the members of the Sanhedrin sitting on the benches of the council hall in front of him. He returned their stares, especially those of the senior members sitting in the front row. He showed no fear. He was ready to begin his defense. Now, my Southern roots may be showing here, but I really liked French Arrington's translation that Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin. And my oldest commentary on the text takes it that way as well. Quote, that is, fastening his eyes steadfastly on those senators who were present at the council. And then Carolus Duval quotes Proverbs chapter 20, verse 1. The wicked flee when no man pursueth, but the righteous are as bold as a lion and shall not be afraid. So Paul's bold look. Even though some people assume that, well, Paul was looking intently because he had weak eyes and he was trying to make out who was there, or some people thought that he might be looking to see if he could find any of his former compatriots who had been complicit in the martyrdom of Stephen. But I think this is questionable speculation. And I really like the way that an old Baptist pastor by the name of T.C. Smith presented it. Paul gazed intently at those assembled. He knew that the priests were going to attempt to make him take the full blame for the commotion of the day before. He refused to be saddled with the responsibility for what happened. Thus, the apostle quickly declared his innocence with the statement, "Brethren, I have lived before God in all good conscience up until today." Now, I like the way Smith sets up the drama there, but his use of the Revised Standard Version translation misses a very beautiful point. Because when Paul brings out his 4-point defense, he's really aware that the Romans are also hearing this statement as well as the Sanhedrin, because since they've brought him over from the Tower of Antonia, and they're probably backing off, they may even not have come into the area where the Sanhedrin was meeting, but they were probably listening because they had responsibility for him as a Roman citizen. So Paul's statement that's often translated that I've lived before God in a good conscience actually literally would say, if you literally translated the Greek, I have been a good citizen of God's state to this day. And I think that's brilliant because he was asserting his innocence before those very people who were supposed to be ruling justly under God's authority. So, as you can see on the screen, Paul's defense can be summarized in this statement in 4 points. Number one, he's lived his life before God. He's lived his life in conformity with God's will as revealed in the law. He is a good citizen of God's state. He's lived with a clear conscience. That's a self-awareness that resulted from knowledge that his behavior in thought, in word, and in deed consistently followed the standard of God's law. So he conformed with God's law, he lived God's standard, and he used the word all for that total obedience. He says, I have a perfectly clear conscience, or I have a totally clear conscience. It's all. His consistent conformity to the will of God applied to all of his behavior in his claim. And number four, it's still relevant because he said, I've lived in conformity to the will of God up through this day. And that's pretty significant. It adds a temporal element to the assertion that he followed God's laws constantly. And even though he's sort of on trial here, he's saying, I'm innocent. I'm still living according to the law, no matter what you think. And so his reward for this is that Ananias orders him struck on the mouth. And this seems to be, a very vivid, colorful, violent way of calling Paul a liar. Now, Ananias is one of those corrupt officials that you see bobbing up and down just when you think they're gone. Because he apparently became high priest back in 47, although it may be as late as 48. And we know from at least one description in Josephus's history that he was a great hoarder of money, and that he would send his servants to the threshing floors to gather the tithes, not the tithes, the tithes that were supposed to go to the priests. So a lot of other priests were starving because Ananias was sending his servants out to the threshing floor to get the tithes that were supposed to come to the other priests. And if they wanted to bring them to the temple instead of giving them to Ananias' servants, they would get beat up for their trouble, because the servants that he got, were not exactly the best citizens of God's kingdom, shall we say. And we know that in 52, he seems to have fallen afoul of Rome. There were a lot of accusations that were brought against him. So he went to Rome and he answered charges. And then he was restored to power by Caesar Claudius. Now, we also know that shortly after the events that happened here, that he was deposed while Felix was still in office. And Felix was only in office till about 59. So, that's the way that happened. And then also, we know that he was murdered during the first Jewish revolt against the Romans in 66. Now, according to the one account that we have, he was hiding in this ditch and he was found out, and they dragged him out of the ditch and executed him right there by the side of the road. So he was murdered during that revolt. So here you go. There's that kind of ne'er-do-well who himself steals from the temple, himself is so scurrilous that he gets in trouble with Rome himself, and it's only Caesar Claudius's own patronage that keeps him in place, as it were. And this is the kind of guy who's not only pointing the finger at Paul, but when he orders a strike on the mouth, like I said, virtually and violently calling Paul a liar, what he's really doing is he's prejudging Paul, and he's saying he is guilty before anything actually happens, before he's heard Paul's defense other than his 4 points of living in right relationship with God. So we already have the violence. Next, we're going to have the cursing. So I guess this is going to at least be rated PG-13 tonight. So anyway, so Paul is so offended that immediately after declaring his innocence, he would have been punished as though he was guilty, that he responds in a turnabout, very effective way of saying, that order to strike Paul, it's so illegal that Paul calls on the Lord to strike Aeneas. And notice that he doesn't make a direct curse. He doesn't say, curse you. What he says is, the Lord is going to strike you. God's going to strike you. So he doesn't say what he's going to do, and he doesn't ask God to do it. He says that's what's going to happen. So rather than just cursing, as a lot of times this is called, what he's doing is really being kind of prophetic. He's really explaining what is going to happen to Aeneas, and guess what? It may take a while, but in 66, Aeneas gets struck down, and he gets struck down for good. It's a lot like Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 28. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, Moses very prophetically says, Israel, if you abandon God, if you turn away from God, then God will send curses and confusion, verse 20. cause pestilence to linger until people die, verse 21. Afflict you with wasting disease, drought, and blight, verse 22. Turn the rain into falling dust, verse 24. And cause military defeats, verse 25. So Paul is acting prophetically. He's in a great tradition of knowing that when people are disobedient to God, God is not going to let it go unanswered. Now, Paul also knows that the order to strike him went counter to God's law. God's law in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 15, which says, you must not act unjustly when rendering judgment. So he feels very confident in likening himself to Moses in pointing out what God is going to do. And then, as he says God's going to get you, he calls him a name. He calls him a whitewashed wall. Now, you probably don't know Ezekiel chapter 13, so I thought I would actually take some of our time to read that to you tonight and make sure you knew what the whitewashed wall was. Therefore, this is what the Lord God says. I am against you because you've spoken falsely and had lying visions. This is the declaration of the Lord God. My hand will be against the prophets who see false visions and speak lying divinations. They will not be present in the fellowship of my people or be recorded in the register of the house of Israel, and they will not enter the land of Israel. And then you will know that I am the Lord Yahweh. And here's where it gets relevant to us. Since they have led my people astray, saying peace when there is no peace, for when someone builds a wall, they plaster it with whitewash. Therefore, tell those who plaster it that it will fall. Torrential rain will come. I will send hailstones plunging down, and a windstorm will be released. Now, when the wall has fallen, will you not be asked, where is the coat of whitewash that you put on it? And of course, since Luke often highlights the similarities between Jesus and his followers when they're persecuted, you could also think about what Jesus called the hypocritical Pharisees in Matthew 23:27. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which appear beautiful on the outside, but inside are full of dead men's bones and every impurity. So even before the crowd identifies Ananias and says, how dare you? How dare you talk with the leader of Israel in this way? Then Paul uses this epithet to suggest that Ananias is a false prophet. And that may also explain what Paul means when the Sanhedrin tries to shame him for speaking so fiercely, and Paul protests, I didn't know he was high priest. Now, I think he was probably snidely implying that a high priest should know better than to break the law. And I'm in pretty good company here because Augustine and Calvin both, Augustine and Calvin both agree with my interpretation that Paul is calling Ananias out for his lack of priestly deportment. But notice the similarities here also with how Jesus was treated in John 18. Because in verse 22 of John 18, the crowd asked Jesus, is that the way you answer a high priest? and they punctuated it with a physical blow to Jesus. The difference is with Paul, the blow comes first and then the umbrage. Now, some people, don't like this idea of Paul saying he didn't know who it was because they've tried to excuse it by saying, well, remember, Paul had weak eyes, or remember, Paul's been away from Jerusalem for a long time, so he may not have known that Ananias was elevated back to the position again, because he had been in trouble before. But that doesn't really make sense as an argument, because someone like Paul, who's very aware of how the Sanhedrin works, how likely is it that he wouldn't know how the high priest dresses, where the high priest sits, or whatever? Now, it is possible that Paul didn't see Ananias give the order. It is possible he didn't know who gave the order, but I think Paul did know. And I think he was using irony that the high priest didn't deserve that respect. And even when he quoted from Exodus 22:28, you must not blaspheme God or curse a leader among your people, I think Paul was undermining the legitimacy of Ananias because he'd already decided that he couldn't get a fair hearing in this group. And so we move to scene 2. Again, I like the way T.C. Smith dramatically sets the scene. Quote, Paul knew that the Romans would lean over backwards to support Ananias since he was a devoted quisling. With his back to the wall, the apostle's only recourse was to introduce an element into the discussion which could divide the group. So Paul realizes that the Pharisees and the Sadducees are split. They're actually, as you can see on the screen, they are split according to politics, because the Sadducees were generally pro-Roman, and the Pharisees only seemed to be pro-Roman on the surface. And they were split on biblical interpretation, because the Sadducees only trusted what they could find in the Pentateuch alone. And the Pharisees were more open to the historical writings and the prophetic writings and the apocalyptic works. And the Sadducees were against everything supernatural, while the Pharisees were open to the idea of angels and demons and the resurrection of the body. Now, I have to confess that when I've read this scene before, I have always seen it deliberately as a divide and conquer strategy. But I'm starting to agree with Eckhart Schnabel when he says that it was more Paul lining up with the Pharisees than actually trying to start the riot that occurred. Because it's better to have some allies than to have no allies. So over the centuries, some Christian commentators, interpreters have criticized Paul. They've said he was disingenuous here when he takes the side of the Pharisees. He wasn't being completely honest. He wasn't being completely truthful. He wasn't representing himself as he really was. But when Paul asserts in the Greek text his affinity with the Pharisees, he says, I am a Pharisee. That's the continuous present. It means in some way Paul felt like he was still consistent with his vows as a Pharisee, the doctrine he learned as a Pharisee. he still felt there was a continuity between his Judaism and Christianity. So he still regarded himself as a Pharisee in some sense, although not as a member of the religious party affiliation, not as a member of the political party, as it were. In fact, some people have criticized and said, that Paul only had the most tenuous relationship with the Pharisees' doctrine, just things like belief in the resurrection. But those people said that it was a partial agreement with the group. But as F.F. Bruce said, that belief in the resurrection that Paul shared with the Pharisaic members of the Sanhedrin, far from being a very partial and limited agreement, was fundamental. Fundamental. And later we'll ascertain why that's fundamental, and also why Paul might have brought that up as opposed to another gambit for his defense. So even though that aspect of the strategy worked, I think it's really interesting that this debate on the resurrection, this idea of identifying with the Pharisees who believe in resurrection, could have led to the sharing of the gospel. Hans Conzelman wrote that the belief in the general resurrection is the connection between genuine Judaism and Christianity. In fact, it was very likely that the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead had actually prepared Paul to believe in Jesus' resurrection from the dead, because Paul had found fulfillment in the messianic hope of resurrection in Jesus Christ. And that hope of resurrection in the Greek grammar is a hendiades, hope and resurrection. Now, I know that's a weird word, so I'm going to explain it to you. A hendiades is a combination of words that you see together more than apart, and that they indicate something, bigger. The part is bigger than the whole. So a hendiades in English would be ham and eggs, which suggests that whole idea of the big American breakfast. Or a hendiades in English would be the sun and the moon, which expresses that whole idea of both daytime heavens and nighttime heavens. So the resurrection is hope, and hope is resurrection. And together they're bigger than just a doctrine, and they're bigger than just a wishful thinking. So while a lot of Jews believed in a future bodily resurrection, when, quote, and I'm quoting from 2nd Maccabees, a non-biblical book in between the Testaments, quote, "The King of the universe will raise us up to an everlasting renewal of life because we have died for his laws," end quote, 2nd Maccabees 7:9. Now, some of the Pharisees accepted the Greek and Roman concept of the immortality of the soul, and so their idea is that the soul lives on after death. That's not New Testament biblical, but that's, one possibility from the Old Testament perspective. But this difference of interpretation and belief regarding the question of the hope divided the Sadducees and the Pharisees so completely that it caused a dispute, verse 10, in the council hall, when Paul had expressed and defended his belief in the resurrection of the dead, because he introduced it as a conviction that he and the Pharisees shared. So now there are going to be some Pharisees who actually want to acquit Paul. But in verse 7, things become really chaotic. There are two words here where the roots in the Greek come over into the English. And I think, was Paul trying to intentionally divide and conquer? I don't necessarily think so. I think he was looking for allies. Was he trying to build sympathy with the Pharisaic minority? Yeah, I think so, as well as to build a base for preaching the gospel. I think he wanted to use that general belief in resurrection to bridge the divide between Judaism and Christianity and to lead to Jesus's resurrection. And also, I think he was successful because I think he wanted some people to see him as victim because he was in the minority of the Pharisees and he believed in the resurrection, which may have been a minority of a minority. But nonetheless, as we know from verse 10, it worked because some people wanted to acquit him. But when we look at the chaos that's pictured over on the right, there are two Greek words from which we get English words. And one of them is stasis. Now, in English, stasis sounds good because stasis means stable. It means it's standing there. But in the Greek, stasis actually means that you're taking a stand. And what it really refers to is a group or two factions in which neither side will give. There is no compromise whatsoever. And one is standing in one place and one is standing in the other and nobody's giving. It's a lot like US politics these days. Nobody wants to compromise. Nobody wants to get anything done. Nobody wants to do anything. Everybody wants a win for themselves and not a win for the US people. Well, in this case, the Sanhedrin was full of people. The Pharisees aren't going to give here and the Sadducees aren't going to give here. So there was a stasis. There was a polarity. There was a serious division. There was a civil war, if you will, in the middle of the Sanhedrin. And also, when it says that they were in conflict, the verb that's used there is the verb from which we get the English word schism, which means a division. So there's a revolt going on here. It's the same noun that was used in Acts, that is used in Acts 24:5, when they accuse Paul in front of Felix of causing disorderly conduct and insurrection among the Jews. I heard Waylene shout, so I hope we're still on. Okay, so are we still on? If anybody could.
Yes, you're on.
Yes.
Okay, all right. I was panicking for nothing. All right, thank you. Okay, so here they are committing the same kind of disorderly conduct they're going to accuse Paul of doing, using the same word, stasis, in the accusations before Felix. But here they are discrediting themselves. Actually, think about it. Even to the Roman soldiers that are outside waiting to take Paul back into custody, they must think that the Jews were inadvertently proving Paul's innocence. In fact, Hans Conselman says this verse 7, points to the hopelessness of a Judaism that denies belief in the resurrection. It is divided within itself. And even today, I have to tell you, that I have been friends with certain Jewish rabbis over the years, and they disagree over the idea of a resurrection or a bodily resurrection. So it is kind of this hopeless Judaism that exists there. So since Paul believes in the resurrection of the dead, several members of the Pharisaical party are willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. They're willing to concede maybe an angel or a spirit spoke to him on the road to Damascus. And so now it says they contended. That literally means they fought for the opinion that since spirits and angels of deceased persons could exist, and since it's possible that Paul claims to have heard the crucified Christ speak to him, as he had claimed in his outer address in the outer court of the temple the day before, that maybe he did hear the spirit or the angel of Jesus speak to him. So given this possibility, they decide they really wouldn't have been shocked if God might send a messenger to enforce his plan, since they really believe God worked through angels and spirits. Now, knowing human nature, as all of a sudden there was some opposition and some vocal speaking in favor of Paul, what happens now is that the stakes have become higher, and Paul's opponents have realized they're losing ground. So you can expect that as they were arguing, they would have gotten louder and more emotional. And so Claudius Lysias' centurion intervenes. He comes in, drags him away from them to protect the life of a Roman citizen. He's taken back to the Tower Antonia, where he'll be safe, but he'll be in custody. Here is some of the pieces that might be part of the Tower Antonia on the left. And here is an artist's conception of what the tower would have looked like in the days of Herod the Great. That's before Paul's time here, but this is the days of grandeur of this tower. So he's taken back to that tower. He's safe, but he's in custody. But what we could say is, the Sanhedrin's case against Paul is quickly coming unglued. Now, if I were filming this as a movie, this next scene I would do as a split screen. The differences between the word that Jesus' spirit brings to Paul on the left and the plotting to murder him by the disaffected members of the Sanhedrin on the right. I wouldn't put any sound on the right side of the screen, just people, making oaths, getting weapons, and hiding along a road in ambush. But I would very clearly present the words of Jesus. Now, flashback. Do you remember that Paul speaks of another vision where Jesus came to him in Jerusalem? In his testimony in Acts 22:18, Jesus told him the same thing Jesus tells him now. Be courageous. But at that time, Jesus was telling him to leave Jerusalem on his own. Now Jesus comes to a discouraged apostle who, despite taking an enormous risk to get to Jerusalem, knowing that he was going to be imprisoned, but hoped that despite the risk, he was going to be able to preach to his brother Jews. And now he feels like a failure. Now he doesn't know if he's even going to get out of Jerusalem. Now his vision of going to the west, maybe even as far as Spain, by way of Rome, is just nothing. So what's he going to do? Well, Jesus assures him, saying, just as you've testified here, as Paul gives his testimony on the steps of the tower earlier, so must he testify in Rome. Now, I love that they in Greek, which means must, have to, need to. just as he had testified here, he must testify in Rome. And F.F. Bruce says this is such a solid assurance that that's probably why, throughout all the things that happened to him on the way to Rome, Paul acts more like a master of events instead of a victim of events. But as far as the counterpoint, let's look at some of the negatives of those guys who are gathering together over there on the right. Let's look at this unholy plot. The first thing is the verb for binding. You know, they bound themselves with an oath, it says. Well, the verb for binding the oath actually incorporates the word anathema. And do you know what anathema is? Anathema is the word for a curse for unbelievers. And this is serious stuff. So they're saying, if we don't accomplish what we're swearing, we deserve to die. We deserve to be cursed. That's pretty serious stuff. And then the fact that they were fasting, and not just fasting, but they were fasting including no water. And you know, you can only live so long with no water. And that means they felt an urgency. They wanted to get it done. They wanted to make sure that that Paul was taken care of. They wanted to have a final solution, if you will, to this problem of Paul. And they wanted to have it probably before the plot could unravel. You know, the more people you have in a conspiracy, the more likely you are for a leak. And also, the longer a conspiracy goes on, the more likely there is for a leak. So they, you know, are cursing themselves if they fail. And they are forcing themselves to make the calendar move forward so that they can make it happen. Also, notice exactly how many Luke tells us are in the conspiracy. 40. Now, 40 is a very natural number. The number 4 represents the created order, the natural order. Why? Because we have 4 cardinal directions, north, east, west, and south. Because in both Ezekiel and Revelation, there are 4 symbolic creatures around the throne. There's domesticated animals, there are wild animals, there are birds, and there are humans. Duh. Okay, humans. There are 4 rivers that flow out of the Garden of Eden. There are 4 seasons. So you see how this 4 represents nature. And how is 10 sufficiency? Because we have 2 hands. We have 5 digits on each hand. So if we have 10, we have both hands full. So if you take 4 and you multiply it by 10, you get 40. That becomes natural sufficiency. 40 days and 40 nights of rain is sufficient to flood the known world at that time. You know, 40 years is sufficient for a whole generation to die off in the wilderness. 40 years is a significant amount of time, a natural amount of time. So, you know, what they're doing is not spiritual. What they're doing is natural. Just wanted you to see that in terms of Hebrew gematria, the symbolism of numbers. And also, if you read on, you see that they got the priests involved. There was plausible deniability for there was no plausible deniability for the chief priests and the council, because they had to send word that they wanted Paul brought to the Sanhedrin so that the ambush could take place and he could be killed. And so we see clearly with all the hints that Luke is giving to us that this event is not of the Lord. However, remember, this is a counterpoint scene. We started with Jesus' assurance that everything's going to be well and you are going to get to Rome. And now we see these people who want to kill him long before he can get to Rome, which is going to be the case. Well, fortunately, God actually has someone that he sends. God sends Paul's nephew, the son of an unmentioned married sister, or maybe maybe he was an honorary uncle, as in Paul's hosts when he came to study under Gamaliel. Maybe he was very close to the host family that was keeping him when he was here. You know how in China you sometimes refer to an elder but close friend as uncle. Well, maybe that's the way Paul was an uncle. But you know, it doesn't really matter to me. All I know is that this seems to be a nephew. I'm going to take it as the nephew. I'm going to assume that he's the son of a married sister, even though the sister has never been mentioned in any of the rest of the scripture. And there's also the questions: how did this nephew hear? Is it possible that the nephew was close enough to some of Paul's old associates that he knew what was going on in the town? Is it possible that the son was serving them food somewhere in an inn and he overheard this plot coming to fruition and he's going, "Oh no, that's Uncle Paul they're talking about"? Is it possible that the son, I mean, the nephew, actually came into the temple in order to try to find out what was going on? That he was, acting kind of as a spy? We really don't know. All we know is he came in and he told his uncle, "This is what's going on." And his uncle does something very wise. Instead of the uncle trying to do something on his own, the uncle decides to appeal to authority. And so he tells the nephew to go to the centurion who's watching over him and tell the centurion to take the nephew to the commander because he has something important to tell the commander. Now, they're taking a risk here. It needs to be something that's important enough to tell the commander that it's of an advantage to the commander. Now, in this case, it could easily be of advantage to the commander, because if you were to find out about a plot, if you were to find out about an insurrection, if you were to find out about some kind of civil disobedience that was going to take place, and the commander could stop it, it would be to the commander's credit. And those commanders wanted to get credits because, they wanted to move up the ranks and to be, accepted in terms of, possibly even being a member of the Senate someday. So that was the situation. The centurion reports to the commander, "There's a young man here who has something to say." By the way, in looking for pictures on this, I found a lot of occasions where they had this really young boy trying to communicate with Paul. You notice that I chose a young man because the word that's used in the Greek refers to a male who could be as old as 30 years old. I actually imagine this nephew being in his 20s. So that's why I chose this artwork that I did. So if it had been a younger boy, maybe the centurion wouldn't even have paid attention and taken commander. But since it's a young man, and since Paul is a Roman citizen, they're going to allow the commander to have the private audience with Paul's nephew. And Paul's nephew tells him what's going to happen, and Lysias is smart enough that he tells the nephew, keep this quiet, keep it private. This is important. And the exciting thing is, Lysias wants to keep it private for a very good reason. He's going to take a covert action because he's going to have Paul sent away by night. Now, I don't know if Paul was actually on horseback on this trip, but we do know that there was a mounted escort that went with him. And hopefully that moon in the back suggests that this is a nighttime trip, despite the white outline on the art. So they go on this trip from Jerusalem, sneaking out at night with an armed escort, and they go as far as Antipatris. Antipatris is about 60 miles from Jerusalem. Caesarea is about 100 miles from Jerusalem. So they went over halfway with Paul, and they camped overnight at Antipatris, and then the bulk of the escort comes back, and the rest goes on to Caesarea. Now, I showed you pictures of Caesarea last time, and even behind me, what we have is part of the racetrack from Caesarea that's still there today. But Caesarea was essentially a de facto capital for the Roman province. And Herod's palace was there, and a big port was there. It had been built in honor of Caesar. So here we have this major plot by Claudius Lysias, and he doesn't just send them off with the escort. He sends a very significant letter with a legal explanation to Felix about what has gone on. Now, there's a lot of legal language in here. If you read those verses, you'll see seized, accused, accuser, deserving death, what the Jews wanted, to disclose, as in today when you read about trials and you hear about disclosure, to order, to give a hearing, to bring a charge. So the escort removes, the rest of them go on 40 miles to Caesarea, and they get there in time to hear from Felix. So in scene 6, Felix agrees to hear the case. The group arrives and they deliver the letter, and Felix agrees to hear the case. But I think you need to know a little bit about Antoninus Felix. Tacitus, the Roman historian, puts it this way, quote, Antoninus Felix practiced every kind of cruelty and lust, wielding the power of king with all the instincts of a slave. He had 3 wives, all of them princesses. That may not seem very significant, but he was not of the aristocracy himself. He was a freedman, and he had the political help and a political alliance of some powerful men. It was very rare to be able to be a proconsul if you were not, at least a tribune. But because of a fellow named Pallas's patronage, he was able to get to this post. But he was angry, and he kept marrying royal wives in order to try to compensate, for what he felt. He was known. Well, I'll say that when we get to chapter 24. He was known as a peacemaker of sorts, but also there were always these rumors and innuendos that a lot of times he was hiring and setting up the troublemakers in order to make his reputation. In other words, nobody really trusted him very much. And so at the end of chapter 23, Paul is imprisoned in Herod's praetorium, waiting for his accusers to come and bring the case. So when we get to scene 7, we're ready for the case. And as we get to the case, instead of Ananias being in court, instead of the members of the Sanhedrin being in court, well, actually, Ananias is there. He comes down with some elders, but they have an attorney by the name of Tertullus. And Tertullus is called forward, and he presents the list of charges against Paul in very much the typical way of the Roman law courts. Now, one thing you should know about these ancient law courts is that hearings were usually open to the public. And so Seneca the elder once warned his students that if they just practiced in the academy, they would be unprepared for the real world of the courts, because he said interruptions are common and speakers had to be loud so that the judges could hear them over the competing noise. In other words, think about all the movies you've seen of courtrooms or the televised court hearings you've heard where you have the judge go order in the court or order, and people have to be quiet or they can end up in jail for contempt of court. So, in this case, what you probably have is a lot of noise that goes on, that people inappropriately cheer and jeer and get their comments in. But nonetheless, there was a formula for how you brought charges. Whoa, what did I do? Can you still see the slide? Or do I have to share again?
No.
Okay. Boy, today is not my day. Are we back?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So you generally begin with what's known as the exordium. And the exordium is the flattery that you use to make sure that the judge is kind of hearing you. And as you are making this flattery, what you're trying to do is to connect it into the charges that you're going to make. You're going to say, wait a second, that sounds kind of familiar. Is there something in the Bible like that? Oh, yeah. Notice that in most of Paul's letters, he begins with a thanksgiving. And if you pay attention to that thanksgiving, the thanksgiving also points to the things he's going to talk to them about, that he's really concerned about. And so as we get into this charges, listen to what in the second part of verse 2 of chapter 24, Tertullus says, "Since through you we enjoy much peace, and since by your provision, most excellent Felix, reforms are introduced on behalf of this nation, in every way and everywhere, we accept this with all gratitude." Now, sometimes these exordia, they go on and on and on with flattery. But Tertullus is kind of smart because in verse 4 he says, "To detain you no further, I beg you in your kindness to hear us briefly." And then he goes into the charges, starting in verse 5. "For we have found this man." Notice this is not the case of the people versus Paul of Tarsus. He doesn't use Paul's name at all. Remember, one rhetorical trick is to dehumanize your opponents. And one of the ways to dehumanize your opponents is to take their identity away from them. So in this case, it isn't Paul. It isn't Paul who claims to be an apostle. It isn't Paul who claims to be a rabbi. It's this man. We have found this man to be a pestilent fellow. Now, pestilent, of course, means to be plagued or to be infested. But in the Roman era, it was used as a term for people who went around causing trouble, scoundrels. And the reason they used pestilent, which would normally mean plagued or infested, is because the idea was that their immorality was a moral plague. And so they're saying that Paul is such a scoundrel, he's a moral plague. The irony here is that pestilent is the adjective that Caesar Claudius himself, the Caesar at this time, that Caesar Claudius himself put on the Jews, those pestilent Jews. So it is entirely ironic that they are projecting their immorality, their obstinance, their troublemaking onto Paul. In fact, pestilence has that idea of unrest. And why is this happening here? It's happening because of the unrest in their own Sanhedrin. But he's not through yet. Not only is he a pestilent fellow, moral contagion, he is an agitator among all the Jews throughout the world. He's seditious. He causes problems. He's an agitator. Why do they put that in? Well, for one thing, it's a new charge. He hasn't been accused of sedition before. He hasn't been accused of being an agitator. And it was customary in ancient rhetoric to take the original charges and to keep adding on offenses, whether you could prove them or not, because the whole idea was if you could add enough offenses in there, you can undermine the defendant's character and you can assist the prosecution. So he's an agitator among Jews all around the world, but it's a brand new charge, and Paul is going to have to answer it. and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. And not only are ringleaders responsible for everything that their followers do, but Tertullus may be trying to signal to Felix that Paul's a very convincing speaker. Don't pay any attention to him. Don't listen to him. He'll deceive you. He'll fool you. You don't want to listen to him. And then he tried to profane the temple, so we arrested him. Is that true? Did he try to define the temple? No, if we think back, the accusation was that he brought a Gentile with him into the temple by the name of Trophimus, but Trophimus never came into the temple. It was something that who made up? The Jews from Asia. And no, I don't mean China and Singapore and Taiwan and Japan. The Jews from Asia being Turkey, Asia Minor. The Jews where Paul's first and second missionary journeys occurred, still causing trouble. Wasn't enough they stoned him almost to death. Wasn't enough that they disrupted churches all around and even followed into Macedonia. No, it wasn't enough. Now they're messing with him in Jerusalem as well. Now, Paul's seizure, not to be confused with a seizure, but Paul's seizure is made to sound like an arrest. But if you'll remember what happened, it was not the temple police that took him. It was the mob. The temple police dressed up so that you knew who they were. They dressed up with symbols of authority. And if they had arrested him, then it would have been a proper seizure. It would have been a proper arrest. But it wasn't them. It was the mob. So this is the list of charges against Paul, which fortunately Paul has a good answer for. But before we get there, notice how Tertullus wraps it up. By examining him yourself, you will be able to learn from him about everything which we accuse him. And once again, he's kissing up to Felix. Oh, you're going to see through him. You're going to understand how guilty he is. You're going to clearly see what a true and faithful case we have. So then the governor does, as is very typical in verse 10, he nods for Paul to make his defense. And now, if you'll pardon me, there's going to be a little Latin on this page. Okay? His offense basically comes in 5 parts. First off, in the last part of verse 10, after he gets nodded to, notice that he says, I realize that for many years you've been judge over this nation, so I cheerfully make my defense. What had Tertullus done? He had kissed up to him and he had said 2 full verses of stuff. And then in verse 4, he says, I'll detain you no further. So he's saying brevity is significant. But when Paul does his opening exordium, his flattery, he says, you've been in charge for 2 years. I've got great confidence in you. He outdoes Tertullus's brevity. The flattery was part of it, but the reality is, that Paul outdoes him. So then Paul goes to the narratio. You may recognize this is the Latin root for narration. This is the just the facts part. So he says, it's been 12 days since he went up to worship. Actually, technically, it's probably been 17 because he's been stewing in the prison there for 5 days, waiting for Tertullus and Ananias and company to come there. So I'm going to go to the next slide so you can see what those days look like. The first day in Acts 21:17, he arrived in Jerusalem. The second day, verse 18, he met with James and the elders. The third to the ninth days, probably the 7 days of purification. Remember, he was going to participate, in the purification for these men and their Nazirite vow. And so you have those 7 days of purification. And it's not until the 10th day that you have the Sanhedrin hearing. So notice what happens. Paul's been in the environs. Presumably with the 7 days of purification, he's been in the holy grounds. He's been there in the temple. And no problem. It isn't until the 10th day that there's a problem. And that was the Sanhedrin hearing. And the Sanhedrin hearing becomes its own problem. Then there was the plot to assassinate him and the transfer, the escape to Caesar and Caesarea, and now the hearing after the 5 days. So the reason for recounting the 12 days since he went to worship is saying, this is relatively recent. This is, not the problem that you are making it. And so then we have the probatio. You may recognize the English word probation coming out of that. It really means proof. And what is Paul's proof? His proof, in verse 12, they didn't find me disputing with anyone. They didn't find me stirring up a crowd, either in the temple or in the synagogues or in the city. In fact, there's still no proof that they can bring up against me. So he's refuting their proof by saying there actually isn't any. And then speaking of refuting, here's the refutation. In the refutation, he's going to say things were okay until the Asian Jews arrived. According to the way, I worship the God of our fathers. I believe everything laid down in the law and the prophets. And I have a hope in God that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust, the judgment. And I always take pains to be a good citizen of God's kingdom, God's state, and toward men. And now I came to bring alms. I was just coming to worship, and they found me purified in the temple. No crowd, no tumult, no mess whatsoever. But these Asian Jews, they stirred up. Where are they? Why aren't they here making this accusation if they really have anything against me? In English law and American law, we have the sense of you have the right to face your accuser. Here, Paul isn't getting to face his accusers because the Asian Jews that started this mess aren't following through because they're sneaky, below the table, despicable guys. And then we get to the peroratio, and we get the word peroratio, which means basically this is where you go back on the counterattack. So then he says, you have a lack of witnesses. They're not here. And the real religious issue is in verse 21, because I cried out while standing among them that I believed in the resurrection of the dead. And now That's why I'm on trial for you in front of this way. So now at this point, we get to Felix's inconclusive verdict. It said that he knew a lot about the way. So he knew that the way was not as much troublemakers as the Jews. So something wasn't ringing true. So he needed more evidence, and he did what was proper here in that he, suspended the trial until Claudius Lysias could come and speak in person. And he said, when Claudius Lysias comes, then I will decide your case. Meanwhile, while waiting for Claudius Lysias to come, that we will get to when we get to chapter 5, there is another scene. And that is, as part of the inconclusive verdict, Paul ends up speaking to both Felix and Drusilla. Paul is either famous or infamous in their perspective. He wants to hear more about what Paul has to say. And since his wife Drusilla is a Jewess, basically he wants to see if she is offended. And Paul preaches a little sermon with 3 basic points. And that is justice, self-control, and future judgment. Now remember, even though Tertullus has flattered Felix on behalf of his justice, and even though Paul has expressed confidence in his justice, the historians tell us that Felix wasn't really just. He was a scurrilous fellow. He was the kind of person who may have caused trouble just so he could put it down. Wow. Ever heard of those kinds of things? False flag operations? Yeah, well, Felix was known for false flag operations. So when Paul talks about justice, basically it's probably hitting Felix in the conscience. And self-control, what did I tell you? I told you he had married 3 princesses. He's concerned about social status. And so what do we have? We have a guy who's probably out of control instead of a person who is in self-control. In future judgment, Paul is talking about God's certain future judgment. And so Felix doesn't like that. One translation says Felix was alarmed and said, go away till I have occasion to summon you. It's a lot like when you're witnessing to someone, and as you're witnessing to them and they're really under conviction, they say, I don't have time to deal with this right now. We'll talk about this at some more convenient time. Or I've got to think about this. Yeah, you know what's happening. You know that Paul spoke, and he spoke with the power of the Holy Spirit, and Felix was under conviction. And so Felix sends him away. Verse 26 tells us he sent him away for another reason too. He was hoping for a bribe. It was customary in those days for prisoners to bribe the judges. And, it was that, some of the supporters of the prisoners would bring coins, bring valuables into the cell so that when he was summoned before the judge for a private audience, he could offer the money. And that's exactly what Felix was hoping for. So, show me the money. And so he sent for Paul often, and he conversed with him. And he dragged this out for 2 years. And then along comes his successor, Porcius Festus. And so Felix, making sure that he doesn't offend the Jews, just leaves Paul in prison. And that would be where we would pick up next time in Acts 25. But what should we learn from this lesson today? I don't know what you would learn from it, but the important lesson to me is never measure God's time in terms of your time. Now, if the Lord had come to me and said, you must go to Rome and preach, and then I get stuck in this Praetorian prison for 2 years, I'm going to be extremely discouraged. I'm going to wonder, was that a figment of my imagination? Was, something wrong? Is God not really in charge? And sometimes we think, I serve God the best I can. I'm really doing everything I possibly can. And I don't know what I could be doing wrong, but I'm not seeing results. It just doesn't seem like anything is happening. And I'm sure it felt that way for Paul, but God still had his appointment, and God had still said, you must go. The other thing that I take heart in is that, what Jesus told him? He said, you will testify as you have testified here. I mean, you must testify as you've testified here. How did he testify there? Essentially testified in chains, essentially testified on the prison steps. That doesn't seem like a very impressive venue for ministry, does it? And we certainly don't see the results of that testifying. So it may well be that Jesus is telling him, you've got to testify in these official venues, even though you can't see what's going to happen. And of course, we know Paul was prolific in writing letters in prison. We know that Paul continued to minister in prison. If there's anything that's mysterious about this account, I wonder, where were Paul's supporters from the Jerusalem church and in both Jerusalem and Caesarea? Because a lot of times the supporters in those days would visit the prison and bring food and bribe the guards so they could stay with him and read scripture with him and pray with him. And in some of the epistles, we have Paul talking about this, but Luke doesn't even mention his own presence as being there. I think he probably was still around. And as I've warned you on many occasions, absence of evidence does not mean evidence of absence. So basically, Luke just assumed it and didn't tell us about it. But the important thing for me to see is that God's timing is not our timing, and that the way we minister, even if it's a must, may not be what would be ideal in our own mind. Let's pray, and then I'll shut off the recording and let you ask questions. Holy Father, thank you for these chapters. And even though, because they are mostly narrative, there isn't a lot of salient preaching points that I see. I still hope, Lord, that you've given us enough to change our lives and to encourage our ministries. In Jesus' holy name, amen. Okay. Oh, I haven't stopped the recording yet.